The night Harlan Easton was buried, the man who had him killed sat at the head of the town council table and declared himself Susanna's most compassionate neighbor. Susanna Easton stood at the graveside of her husband with red dirt on her boots and fury in her chest, so hot she thought it might burn through the black wool of her mourning dress. The September wind swept across the New Mexico territory like a warning, carrying with it the smell of juniper and dust, and the distant promise of a storm that had not yet decided to arrive. She was 29 years old, recently widowed, and already she could feel the eyes of Caldwell Creek settling on her the way a hawk settles its gaze on a field mouse, patient, certain, and without mercy. The year was 1883, and in the New Mexico territory, a woman alone was considered a problem to be solved by whatever man moved quickest. Harlan had not been a perfect man. He had been stubborn and sometimes cold, and he had loved his cattle more than he had ever loved conversation. But he had been honest, which was more than could be said for most men in Caldwell Creek, and he had built the Easton Ranch with his own 2 hands on land he had paid for in full with money earned honestly. The deed was tucked beneath the floorboards of their kitchen, folded in oilskin, and Susanna knew its contents by heart because Harlan had read it to her the night they first moved into the house, his voice rough with something that was as close to tenderness as he ever came. Now that deed was what men wanted, and Harlan was in the ground because of it. She knew it in the way that women who have lived on the frontier learn to know things, through the accumulation of small details that do not announce themselves, but simply gather, quiet and damning, until the picture they form is impossible to ignore. The night before Harlan was found at the bottom of Cartwright Gulch, she had heard 2 horses moving past the south fence line. Harlan's horse had come home alone, lathered and trembling. And then there was the matter of what Deputy Cord Tillman had said when he brought her the news, which was that her husband had apparently fallen from his horse in the dark, a man who had ridden in darkness every night of his adult life without incident. There was also the matter of Wallace Greer. Wallace Greer was the richest man in 3 counties. He owned the mill, the bank, and the largest cattle operation north of the Rio Grande. He had been trying to buy the Easton land for 2 years, offering prices that climbed steadily every time Harlan declined, and the last time Harlan had refused him 4 days before he died, Greer had reportedly told the man at the feed store that Harlan Easton was the most foolish man alive. 4 days later, Harlan Easton stopped being alive at all. Susanna had said none of this aloud. She had gone through the motions of grief and burial and the accepting of casseroles from women who whispered behind their hands. She had listened to Reverend Platt speak about Harlan's soul. She had thanked people for coming. And all the while something hard and resolute was forming inside her, the way iron forms when fire and pressure are applied in equal measure. She had been at the graveside for perhaps 10 minutes when she heard footsteps approaching from the direction of the church, unhurried and deliberate. She did not turn immediately. She was not ready to face anyone with sympathy in their expression. Mrs. Easton. The voice was low and careful, and there was nothing performative about the condolence in it. She turned. The man standing at the edge of the cemetery was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that had been recently cut, but was already beginning to rebel at the temples. He wore a plain brown vest over a white shirt, with a marshal's badge pinned to the vest that caught the afternoon light. His hat was in his hands, which she noticed immediately as an act of genuine respect rather than social obligation. His face was angular but not harsh, with the kind of lines that came from years of squinting into sunlight rather than from meanness. She did not recognize him. "I don't believe we've met," she said. "No, ma'am. I arrived in Caldwell Creek 3 days ago." "Lionel Barker. I'm the territorial marshal assigned to this district. I was sent down from Santa Fe after some concerns were raised about land disputes and missing cattle in the region." He paused. "I'm sorry for your husband. I mean that sincerely." She studied him for a moment. There was something about the directness of his gaze that she found unusual, not aggressive, but honest in a way that most men in positions of authority had long since traded away for comfort. He looked to be somewhere in his early to mid-30s, with the kind of steadiness about him that suggested he had seen enough of the world to have stopped pretending it was simpler than it was. "Thank you, Marshal Barker," she said. "Are you attending the burial on official business?" "Partly," he said, "and partly because it seemed like the right thing to do." He looked toward the grave, and for a moment his expression was thoughtful rather than official. "Your husband built something worth building out here. That deserves acknowledging." She felt something loosen slightly in her chest, not grief, but the particular strain of holding everything tightly together in public. "Did you know him?" I had spoken with him twice since arriving. He was one of the ranchers who had written to Santa Fe with concerns about Greer's operation. The way his cattle kept ending up inside Greer's count, the pressure being applied to smaller landowners. Lionel Barker met her eyes. "I came to look into those concerns, Mrs. Easton. I intend to continue doing so." She said nothing for a long moment, looking at the marshal with the kind of careful assessment that women who have had to read men for their survival develop into an art form. Then she said, "Will you be attending the gathering at the house this evening?" "If you're extending an invitation," he said. "I am," she said, and she turned back to face Harlan's grave. The gathering that evening was everything such gatherings always were in small western towns, a performance of community solidarity that was really a performance of surveillance. People wanted to see how the widow was holding up. They wanted to assess her intentions regarding the ranch. They wanted to determine whether she would be sensible and sell, which in this context meant whether she would be sensible and surrender. Wallace Greer arrived at 7 o'clock with a bottle of bourbon, and a face arranged into an expression of profound sympathy that did not reach his eyes. He was a large man in his early 50s, with the kind of physical confidence that came from having never in his adult life been told no by anyone with the power to enforce it. He shook Susanna's hand and said all of the appropriate things, and when he finally got to the part about how she shouldn't have to carry the burden of the ranch alone, she smiled and said she appreciated his concern. Lionel Barker stood near the fireplace for most of the evening, drinking water from a coffee cup because someone had mistakenly handed it to him and he hadn't corrected the error. He watched the room in a way that appeared casual but was not. Susanna, who was watching him while appearing to watch everyone else, noticed the moment his attention sharpened when Cord Tillman spoke to Greer in the corner of the room with a familiarity that exceeded what a deputy sheriff ought to have with a civilian in a professional setting. She caught Lionel's eye across the room. He gave the smallest possible nod, which she interpreted correctly as confirmation that he had noticed the same thing. After most of the guests had gone, she found him still there, waiting with the quiet patience of a man who understood that some conversations required the departure of an audience. She poured 2 cups of actual coffee and handed him one. "The deputy and Greer know each other well," she said. "Better than professionally warrants," he agreed. "Did you know that before tonight?" "I suspected it." She set her cup down and looked at him directly. "Marshal Barker, my husband, did not fall from his horse." A pause, then with no surprise in his voice, only a kind of careful gravity, "Tell me what you know." And she did. She told him about the horses she had heard the night Harlan died, about the lathered condition of Harlan's animal, about the 2 years of escalating pressure from Greer, about the conversation at the feed store 4 days before Harlan's death. She told him about the way Tillman had broken the news to her, with a looseness in his manner that she had taken for laziness at the time, but now read as the ease of someone delivering information he had been expecting to deliver. She told him all of it, and she watched Lionel Barker listen with the focused attention of someone who was not simply waiting for his turn to speak. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to look into this more thoroughly before I make any move. I need more than what we have." "So do I," she said. "I have no intention of doing anything rash." He looked at her with something that might have been reassessment, the look of a man who had arrived with certain expectations about what a recently widowed woman would be like, and was finding those expectations insufficient. "What I'd like to do," he said carefully, "is come back in the morning and take a look at the area around Cartwright Gulch before Tillman or anyone else has reason to disturb it further." "Be here at 6, she said. "I'll have coffee ready." He was there at 5:55. They rode out to Cartwright Gulch in the thin gray light before sunrise, Susanna on her dun mare, and Lionel on a big roan gelding that moved with the efficiency of an animal that had spent its life being asked to cover ground. They did not speak much on the way out. The landscape demanded a certain quality of quiet, the mesa land in the early morning, with the light coming in flat and golden, and the air carrying the particular clarity of high desert before the heat of the day absorbed it. Susanna had lived in this landscape for 8 years, and she still found it beautiful in a way that moved her. At the gulch, Lionel dismounted and walked the area with methodical slowness, studying the ground. Susanna watched from horseback at first, then tied her mare and followed him on foot because she saw what he was looking at and she trusted her own eyes. The story that the ground told was not the story of a man who had fallen. "2 sets of boot prints," Lionel said, crouching near the edge. "Not Harlan's. He wore a square-toe boot, and the tracks from his horse that night would have come in from the north pasture. These prints are pointed to 2 different men, and they came from the east." "Greer's ranch is east," Susanna said. "I know." He stood and looked down into the gulch, which was not dramatic, a 20-foot drop onto a rocky creek bed that would be more than sufficient to kill a man or make his death look accidental. Was there any report of what condition he was found in? Tillman said he appeared to have fallen from his horse and struck his head on the rocks. She paused. But when I asked Doc Hennessy directly, he said the injury pattern was consistent with a blow to the head sustained before impact with the ground. He said it in a way that suggested he was not going to say it again. Lionel turned to look at her. "Hennessy told you that?" "He told me it in a way that could be interpreted either way," she said. "He is not a brave man, but he is an honest one in his limited fashion. Would he testify to that interpretation? If he felt sufficiently protected from the consequences, possibly." She met Lionel's gaze. "This is what I have been thinking about. What can actually be proven and before whom?" "Justice of the Peace Merton runs the court sessions for the district," Lionel said. "He comes through on a circuit. He's due in Caldwell Creek in 4 days. "Then 4 days is what we have," she said. They rode back to the ranch, and over coffee at the kitchen table they began to think through what evidence might be assembled, how it might be presented, and what risks each step involved. Lionel had a lawman's way of approaching things, sequential, documented, mindful of what a court would require versus what was simply true. Susanna had a different kind of intelligence, one built from years of watching people in a small community and understanding what motivated them, what they feared, and what might move them to act. Together, these 2 ways of thinking began to produce something that felt, for the first time since Harlan's death, like the shape of a possible path forward. Then 2 days before Justice Merton was due to arrive, Wallace Greer made his move. He came in person, which Susanna had not expected. She had expected a letter, or perhaps Tillman arriving with some official-sounding document. Instead, Greer himself rode up to her door on a Tuesday afternoon with 2 of his ranch hands positioned behind him, and an envelope in his hand that he held out to her with the practiced ease of a man who did not expect to be refused. She took the envelope. Inside was a formal notice, signed by Tillman in his capacity as deputy sheriff, citing concerns about a woman operating a cattle operation alone and without proper male supervision, and citing a territorial statute that Susanna had never heard of and immediately suspected had been drafted for exactly this kind of purpose. The notice informed her that she had 24 hours to vacate the Easton property and the surrounding territory, after which point the land would be held in custody pending a determination of its rightful disposition. The notice was dated that morning. It gave her until 9 o'clock the following morning. She read it twice, slowly, keeping her face entirely still. Then she looked up at Greer. "And if I decline to vacate, Mrs. Easton?" He said her name with the specific quality of patience that men deploy when they want a woman to understand that her preferences are an inconvenience rather than a factor. "You're alone. You're in mourning. This land is too much for one person to manage, and the territory has an interest in seeing it managed properly. I'm prepared to offer you a very fair price, enough to start comfortably somewhere else, somewhere easier. Santa Fe, perhaps, even back east. The territorial statute you've cited here," she said, looking down at the paper. "I'd like to see the original text," a flicker of something behind his eyes. "Your husband's lawyer in Socorro I'll want to see it today," she said. "Before I make any decision." He left, seemingly satisfied that the notice had done its work, that she would be packing her things within the hour. The moment his horses cleared the gate she was moving, walking fast to the barn, saddling the dun mare and riding hard for town. She found Lionel at the boarding house where he was staying, sitting at a small desk by the window with a stack of papers in front of him and a pen in his hand. He looked up when she knocked and stepped in, and she handed him the notice without preamble. He read it. She watched his jaw tighten, which was the most expressive she had seen him. "This statute," he said, "does it exist?" "There are territorial statutes about estate management when a landowner dies intestate," he said. "But you are not intestate. Harlan had a will, and you are the named beneficiary. This statute as described here," he tapped the paper. "I need to verify this, but it doesn't read like anything I've seen." "He has 20 hours of a head start," she said. "If this lands before a judge before I can contest it, it won't land before Merton," Lionel said. "Merton is who Greer is afraid of. This is designed to get you out of the territory before Merton arrives day after tomorrow." He set the paper down on his desk and looked at her steadily. 24 hours. "I know," she said, "and I intend to use every one of them." Something shifted in his expression then, something that he appeared to decide not to suppress. "Then tell me what you need and let's get to work." She had already made a list in her head on the ride into town. She laid it out for him now, and he listened, and together they divided the tasks between them with the efficiency of people who had already learned to think in the same register. The statute was the first thing. Lionel had access to the territorial law library in Socorro, which was 80 miles away, too far to ride and return in 24 hours. But the circuit judge's clerk, a meticulous man named Abernethy who had spent 40 years copying out legal documents in a hand that was nearly mechanical in its precision, kept personal copies of every statute he had ever processed. He lived 3 streets over from the boarding house. Susanna went to see Abernethy while Lionel rode to the telegraph office to send a wire to Santa Fe requesting confirmation of the statute's validity. She knocked on Abernethy's door at 3:30 in the afternoon and found him in his garden, tending to a row of onions with the focused affection of a man who had transferred all his emotional investment to horticulture. "Mr. Abernethy," she said, "I need to ask you about a territorial statute regarding land and widow estates." He straightened and looked at her with the sharp, measuring attention of a man who had spent his career determining what people actually needed from what they claimed to need. "Which statute?" She read him the citation from the notice. He frowned. "That doesn't sound right," he said. "Come inside." His study was a remarkable room, every surface covered in the accumulated documentation of decades of territorial law, arranged in a system that appeared chaotic but was apparently navigable because he moved through it with confidence and certainty, pulling out volumes and running his finger down indices. After 20 minutes he looked up. "There is no statute with that citation," he said. "The citation number belongs to an 1871 act regarding water rights on communal land. Whoever wrote this notice either made an error or he paused, or invented the citation outright." "Would you be willing to state that in writing?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. "For what purpose?" she told him. She told him plainly, without dramatic emphasis, laying out what she believed and what she could demonstrate. Abernethy was quiet through all of it. He was not, she sensed. a man who was easily moved to action, but he was a man who was moved by the specific offense of falsified legal documents, which to him represented something like a personal affront. "Give me an hour," he said. "I'll have a written attestation ready." She was back on the street by 5 o'clock. The light was going amber and the shadows of buildings were stretching long across the main road of Caldwell Creek. She had 17 hours remaining. She went next to Doc Hennessy. He was in his office, which also served as the surgery, sitting behind his desk with a glass of whiskey at his elbow. He was a thin man of perhaps 60, with the slightly haunted quality of someone who had spent too many years in a frontier town, and had found that whiskey bridged the gap between what he had imagined his life would be and what it was. He looked up when she entered, and something in his face shifted uncomfortably. "Easton," he said. "I'm very sorry for Doctor," she said. "I need you to tell me again what you told me about Harlan's injuries." He picked up his whiskey glass and then set it down again without drinking from it. "I told you what I could determine from my examination. You told me the injury pattern was consistent with a blow sustained before impact with the ground," she said. "And you said it in a way that allowed for other interpretations. I need you now to say it in a way that doesn't." The silence in the room was considerable. Outside, someone was driving a wagon past the office, and the sound of it filled the space between them. "If I say that," he said slowly, "and I am wrong, are you wrong?" Another silence, longer this time. "No," he said at last, in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "I'm not wrong. The pattern of the injury, the bruising, the way that..." He stopped and then began again more formally, as though he were already composing the text of what he would say in court. "In my medical opinion, Harlan Easton sustained the blow that killed him prior to the fall into the gulch. The injury is not consistent with a fall from horseback. It is consistent with a strike from a blunt object delivered at a downward angle by a person standing above and to the right of the victim. Would you write that down?" She asked. Susanna. He had never used her first name before. She looked at him. His face was tired and sorry and a little afraid. "You understand what will happen if I do?" "Yes," she said, "and I understand what will have happened to my husband if you don't." He picked up a pen. 15 hours remaining. She met Lionel back at the boarding house at 7 in the evening. He had received a reply from Santa Fe, confirming that the statute cited in the notice did not exist in the territorial code. He had the telegram in his hand when she arrived, and she handed him the written attestation from Abernethy and the signed statement from Hennessy, and they sat across from each other at the small desk in his room and laid everything out in front of them like pieces of a map being assembled. "Hennessy actually signed it," Lionel said, reading through the doctor's statement. "He did," she said. He looked up at her. There was something in his eyes that she found difficult to name and did not in that moment try to. "That took something," he said, "getting him to do that. It took telling him the truth plainly," she said. "Most people are braver than they think when someone treats them as though they are." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then he looked back at the papers. "We have Abernethy's attestation that the statute doesn't exist. We have Hennessy's statement about the cause of death. We have the boot prints at Cartwright Gulch, which I documented with a sketch and measurements this afternoon. We have the history of Greer's attempts to purchase the land and the report from the feed store about his remark." "The feed store man," she said. "His name is Dix Fowler. He's been in Caldwell Creek his whole life. He has no particular loyalty to Greer and some particular loyalty to telling things the way they happened, which is a quality I have always respected in him. Would he speak to it?" "Let's find out," she said, and stood up. Dix Fowler operated his feed store on the south end of town and lived in the back rooms of it, which meant that when they arrived at 8 o'clock in the evening he was still accessible and only mildly put out by the hour. He was a compact, weathered man of perhaps 50, with the permanent squint of someone who had spent decades measuring grain in bad light. He listened to what Susanna said with the stillness of a man who was thinking rather than simply waiting, and when she finished he said, Greer said it plain as anything. Said Harlan was the most foolish man alive. Said a fool like that gets what's coming to him eventually. I remember thinking it was a strange way to put it. Would you say that to a judge? Lionel asked. Dix looked at the marshal badge and then at Susanna and then back at Lionel. Are you going to be around after you say these things in court? He asked. Or does the territory pull its marshals back to Santa Fe and leave the rest of us to manage the consequences? I will personally ensure that Greer is unable to create consequences for anyone in this county, Lionel said, and he said it with a quiet certainty that Susanna could feel had its roots in something deeper than professional obligation. Dix nodded slowly. I'll say it, he said. Write it down now if you want. They walked back through the night streets of Caldwell Creek with the statements in Susanna's saddlebag and 11 hours remaining on the notice. The town was quiet. A piano from the saloon, 2 streets over, was playing something that had been a popular melody a decade ago in more crowded places. The night air was cool enough to see breath, and the stars above the territory were enormous and indifferent. There's one more thing, Susanna said as they walked. The notice itself, Lionel said. He had been thinking about the same thing. Tillman signed it, but Tillman isn't the kind of man who drafts legal documents on his own initiative. No, she said. He had help. And whoever helped him wrote a statute citation that doesn't exist, which means they were either careless or they assumed no one would check. Greer's man in Santa Fe is a lawyer named Prout, Lionel said. I've been looking at Prout for separate reasons. He's filed the paperwork on several land transfers in this territory over the past 3 years, transfers that follow a pattern: rancher dies or disappears, land transfers to Greer within 6 months. She stopped walking. How many? 3 confirmed, possibly 2 more. He stopped beside her and they stood on the empty street looking at each other. The single gas lamp on the corner threw enough light to see his face clearly, and what she saw there was a man who was angry in a contained, professional way, but angry genuinely. This is larger than Harlan, he said. Larger than your ranch. You understand that once we walk into that courtroom tomorrow, this becomes about all of it. Good, she said. It should be about all of it. Another of those pauses in which the space between them felt charged with something that was not about the case at all. Then he said, quietly, You are remarkable, Mrs. Easton. She felt the words land somewhere specific inside her chest. Susanna, she said. Susanna, he repeated, and even the way he said her name was careful, as though he understood that taking it as permission was something he did not intend to take for granted. They parted at the boarding house and she rode home to the ranch, because she was not going to be driven from it before she chose to leave it, which she would not. She sat at the kitchen table with the deed in her hands and the lamp burning low, and she thought about Harlan, who had built this house and read her the deed on their first night in it. She thought about what he had been trying to do out here, and what had been done to him, and what she was going to do about it. The anger was still there, that hot, iron thing in the center of her chest, but it was no longer the only thing she felt. Alongside it, carefully, like a plant that has only just broken the surface of the ground, was something else. She did not examine it closely. There was not time, and the hour was not right. She put the deed back in the oilskin, replaced it under the floorboard, and went to bed for 3 hours because she intended to be clear-headed in the morning. She was awake at 4. 8 hours remained, but she was not going to wait all 8 of them. She dressed in her best black dress, the one she had worn to the territorial governor's reception 2 years ago when Harlan had taken her down to Santa Fe because he said she deserved to see something grand at least once in her life. It was a dress that communicated seriousness and the knowledge of one's own dignity, which was exactly the communication she intended to make. She wrote 3 notes. The first was to Abernethy, asking him to attend the courthouse by dawn and to bring his original copies of the territorial law volumes for reference. The second was to Hennessy, asking him to do the same, to be present, and to bring his medical records of Harlan's examination. The third was to Dix Fowler, asking him to come as early as he could manage. She sent all 3 notes with her ranch hand. A steady young man named Felix who was 18 and deeply loyal, and had been shaken to his boots by what had happened to Harlan. He rode out into the dark without question. Then she saddled the dun mare and rode back into town. It was still full dark when she arrived at the boarding house, but there was lamplight visible in Lionel's window, and she knew he had not slept much either. She knocked. He opened the door immediately, already dressed, already alert. "You're early," he said. "I know," she said. "I sent for Abernethy and Hennessy and Dix Fowler. They should be at the courthouse by first light. Justice Merton, where is he?" "He arrived last night," Lionel said. "He's staying at the hotel. I spoke with him late in the evening, gave him a brief summary of the situation." He paused. "He's inclined to hear the case. He's not a man who reacts well to the misuse of legal process, and a forged statute citation is something he will take personally. Can Greer prevent the court from convening?" "Not through legitimate means," Lionel said. "And Merton is not a man who bends to illegitimate ones." He looked at her with the careful assessment she was coming to recognize as his version of close attention. "How are you?" The question caught her off guard precisely because it was direct and personal and had nothing to do with the case. She considered giving him a practical answer, something about being ready, being prepared, all the things that were true. Instead, she said, "Frightened and certain." "Both at the same time?" He nodded slowly. "In my experience, that is exactly how honest people feel before they do something that matters." They walked to the courthouse in the dark, arriving at the building just as the first pale suggestion of dawn was beginning to separate the eastern horizon from the sky above it. The courthouse in Caldwell Creek was a plain adobe building that served multiple civic functions, and therefore felt, in its interior, like a room that was always trying to be something slightly different from what it was. But it had a proper bench and proper seating, and as the lamplight inside warmed the space and Abernethy arrived with his volumes and Hennessy arrived looking pale and determined, and Dix Fowler arrived smelling of grain and resolution, it began to feel like the kind of room where things were decided. Justice Merton arrived at dawn. He was a compact man in his late 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the brisk manner of someone who had been on a circuit long enough to find inefficiency offensive. He had read the documents Lionel had provided the night before, and he had also read the forged notice, and the expression on his face when he sat at the bench and looked out at the assembled people suggested that he had already formed some opinions. Cord Tillman had been notified that court was convening. He arrived at 7 minutes past dawn with the slightly panicked look of a man who had expected this morning to go differently. He was followed, shortly after, by Wallace Greer himself, who came in with 2 men in suits who were presumably the legal representation he'd had time to summon, and whose confidence was somewhat less absolute than it had been the previous afternoon. Susanna sat in the front row on the left side of the aisle. Lionel stood to her right, beside the marshal's position near the bench. He caught her eye once before proceedings began, and the steadiness she saw in his expression settled something in her own. Merton called the session to order with the abruptness of a man who found formalities wasteful when there was substance to be dealt with. "I have before me a notice of forced vacatur issued against one Susanna Easton, widow, under citation of a territorial statute," he said. "I have also before me an attestation from the court's own long-serving clerk, Mr. Abernethy, that the cited statute does not exist in the territorial code and that the citation number refers to a wholly different act. I would like to begin by addressing this discrepancy." Greer's lawyers made a motion. Merton dismissed it without apparent interest. Abernethy stood and read his attestation in the precise, methodical voice of a man for whom accuracy was a moral position, and he presented the volumes, open to the relevant pages, which confirmed the absence of the cited statute and the presence of the actual statute to which the citation number belonged. The court clerk, who was also Abernethy's former apprentice, verified the volumes. It was, in its way, irrefutable. Then Hennessy stood. He was more visibly nervous than Abernethy, but there was something about standing in the formal context of a courtroom, under oath, that appeared to have anchored him. He read his statement in a voice that only trembled slightly, and then he answered Merton's direct questions with the precision of a man who had made a decision about what kind of person he intended to be and had found the decision clarifying. Lionel Easton had been struck before he fell. Greer's lawyers objected, and Merton sustained some objections and overruled others, and through all of it Susanna sat still and watched and breathed carefully. Lionel presented the documentation of the boot prints at Cartwright Gulch, with his sketches and measurements, establishing that 2 men had stood at the edge of the gulch on the night Harlan died, men who had come from the east, from the direction of Greer's ranch. Dix Fowler testified about what Greer had said at the feed store 4 days before Harlan's death. And then Lionel presented to the court the results of his wire to Santa Fe, which included not only the confirmation that the statute did not exist, but also the preliminary findings of his broader investigation into land transfers in the territory: 3 ranches, 3 dead men, 3 transfers to Wallace Greer within 6 months of each death, a pattern that the Territorial Attorney General's office had been notified of and was already preparing to investigate formally. The room was very quiet. Greer's lawyers were speaking over each other. Tillman had gone the color of old paste. Greer himself sat very still with the expression of a man calculating how this had happened, how the woman in the front row had managed, in 24 hours, to dismantle what he had been building for years. Merton looked at Wallace Greer over his wire-rimmed glasses for a long, deliberate moment. Then he said, "The notice of forced vacatur is declared invalid on the basis of a forged statute citation and is dismissed with full prejudice. The Easton Ranch and all associated land remains in the lawful possession of Mrs. Susanna Easton." Furthermore, Deputy Sheriff Cord Tillman, as the officer who signed and issued a document citing a non-existent statute, is hereby suspended from duty pending investigation. The matters raised regarding the pattern of land transfers and the circumstances of Harlan Easton's death are referred to the Territorial Attorney General's office for formal investigation. He looked at Greer one more time. "I would strongly advise you, Mr. Greer, not to leave the territory." Greer left the courtroom with his lawyer speaking rapidly in his ears, and something in his bearing that was unmistakably diminished, the specific deflation of a man who has just learned that the world contains people he underestimated. Tillman left without speaking to anyone. Susanna sat in the front row for a moment after the room began to empty, feeling the particular stillness of a person who has been running very fast for a very long time and has just been allowed to stop. The lamp at the front of the courtroom made the morning light warm and amber, and through the high window she could see the sky fully light now, broad and blue and immense, the New Mexico sky that she had loved from the first morning she had woken up underneath it. "Susanna." She looked up. Lionel was standing in front of her. His hat was in his hands again, the way it had been at the graveside, and something about that repetition felt meaningful in a way she did not try to analyze but simply registered, warm and specific. "It held," she said. "It held," he agreed. "You held it together." "We did," she said firmly. He looked at her with an expression that she had not yet seen from him, one that was unguarded in a way that his face in professional contexts was not. There was admiration in it, and something that was not simply professional regard, something quieter and more personal than that. "What will you do now?" he asked. She stood up. They were very nearly the same height when she was standing, and he was without his hat, which she noticed in a way that felt oddly intimate. "Go home," she said. "Tend to my cattle. Wait to hear what the Attorney General's office does with the investigation." She paused. "What will you do?" "I'll need to remain in the district for the investigation," he said. "That could be months." "I see," she said, and she did not try to keep from her voice the particular quality of being glad about something. He said very quietly, "Would you object to my calling on you, outside of official business?" "Marshal Barker," she said, and there was something warm and almost amused in her voice that she had not heard from herself in some time. "I spent 24 hours gathering evidence, stood in a courtroom at dawn, and won. I am not going to be frightened by a man who takes off his hat at a graveside and asks politely before he calls." He smiled. It changed his whole face in the way that smiles do when they are real, the lines at his eyes deepening and the severity of his expression giving way to something that was simply genuine and warm. And she thought, not for the first time in the last 24 hours, but for the first time consciously and without qualification, that Lionel Barker was a man worth knowing. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "I'll ride out. I'll have coffee ready," she said. And she walked out of the courthouse into the full morning light, into the New Mexico air that smelled of juniper and red earth, and the particular freshness that follows the resolution of a thing that needed resolving. And she untied the dun mare and rode home. The weeks that followed were the kind that changed the shape of a life without announcing that they were doing so. The Territorial Attorney General's investigation moved at the pace of territorial bureaucracy, which was to say it moved with determined slowness that occasionally erupted into decisive action. Wallace Greer was formally charged with conspiracy in the deaths of Lionel Easton and 2 other ranchers whose cases were reopened. The men who had owned the other 2 ranches, where the pattern of transfer matched. Cord Tillman entered into an agreement with the Attorney General's investigators and provided testimony that implicated both Greer and Pruitt, the Santa Fe lawyer. In exchange, he received a sentence that was lighter than he deserved, but sufficient to remove him from Caldwell Creek permanently. Pruitt was disbarred and charged with fraud and conspiracy. Greer was ultimately convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, with the physical evidence from Cartwright Gulch and Hennessy's testimony forming the spine of the case. He was sentenced to 20 years in the Territorial Prison in Santa Fe. His ranch and properties were seized as part of the proceedings, and the land that had been transferred to him under suspicious circumstances was returned to the surviving families where possible. Susanna was not present for all of these proceedings. She testified when required, clearly and precisely, and the rest of the time she ran her ranch, which she discovered she was quite capable of doing, and received visitors on Thursday evenings, one of whom came every Thursday without fail and sometimes on other days as well, ostensibly on official business. Lionel Barker was, she found, someone who was better the more she knew him, which was not a quality she had encountered universally in people, and which she valued accordingly. He was deliberate in everything, in his thinking, in his speech, in his movements. But the deliberateness was not coldness. It was the particular care of a man who took seriously the things that mattered to him. He listened when she spoke in the way that people who have genuinely decided that the other person's words matter do listen, not waiting for his turn, but actually taking in what she said and thinking about it. She found herself thinking about him at odd moments during the day, while moving cattle along the east fence line, while mending tack in the barn, while looking out at the evening light turning the mesa gold and rose. She thought about the way he had stood at the graveside with his hat in his hands. She thought about the way he had said her first name for the first time, careful and deliberate, as though he understood that permission was not a formality. He came on a Thursday in late October with the first real cold of autumn in the air, and they sat on the porch after supper as they had begun to do, with coffee and the broad territorial night above them, and they talked about a great many things. About where he had grown up, which was in Missouri, in a town that was not so different from Caldwell Creek except that it was smaller and flatter. About his years as a lawman, which had taken him from Kansas through Colorado and down into the territory. About her years in New Mexico, what had drawn her west, what she had found and what she had not expected. They talked about the landscape with the specific love of people who have chosen to be in a place rather than been placed there. At some point in the evening, the conversation slowed and became something else, a comfortable silence that neither of them felt the need to fill. The stars above the territory were extravagant, and the coyotes were singing to each other across the mesa, and the air had the cold clarity of high desert autumn. "Susanna," he said, and the way he said her name with that same deliberateness, the same quality of having thought about whether to say the next thing, she knew what was coming, and she turned toward him in her chair and waited. "I'm not a man who says things he does not mean," he said. "So when I say that the last 2 months have been the most that you have been—" He stopped, which was unusual for a man who generally had a clear, linear relationship with language. He tried again. "I think you may be the finest person I have met in my life, and I am aware that the timing of that and the circumstances of that are complicated, and I do not wish to be careless with your grief or with you. So I will only say it once clearly, and you may do with it whatever you see fit." She looked at him in the starlight, and she felt the thing that had been growing quietly in her chest for 2 months, growing with each Thursday visit and each frank conversation and each moment when she had looked at this man and found something reliable and genuine looking back at her. She felt it fully and without apology. "Lionel," she said, "I am 30 years old. I have lived on the frontier for 8 years. I know what I think and feel and want, and I do not require protection from my own emotions." She held his gaze. "I think you are the finest person I have met in my life as well. And I would very much like you to stop saying you will only say things once and simply continue to say them." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "May I take your hand?" "Yes," she said. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand in both of his, and it was a gesture of such careful, specific tenderness that she felt it move through her like warmth. They sat like that for a long time, in the cold air and the enormous night, and it was the most comfortable she had felt in a very long time, which told her what she already knew, that comfort and certainty are not things to be suspicious of, but things to be received when they are offered honestly. He began courting her with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to everything, which in practice meant that he was thoughtful and consistent and never careless. And it meant that the people of Caldwell Creek, who watched with the usual frontier town interest in other people's developments, had very little to gossip about except that Marshal Barker appeared to be genuinely suited to Susanna Easton, and that Susanna Easton appeared to have no objection to being courted. Abernethy, who had been one of the witnesses to the courtroom proceedings, told his wife that it was gratifying to see things turn out correctly. Dix Fowler told everyone who came into his feed store that he had known from the moment Susanna had come to his door in the dark, that she was a woman who knew exactly what she was doing, which was not entirely accurate but was the kind of thing that felt true enough to be worth saying. Doc Hennessy, who had achieved a kind of local quiet heroism from his testimony that he had not expected, and which appeared to have done something good for his sense of himself, told the story of the 24 hours several times to different people, and each time it was slightly more dramatic than the last but always accurate in the parts that mattered. Winter came to the territory in December with seriousness, bringing heavy frost and occasional snow that blew in sideways off the mesa and made the cattle difficult, and the fence lines treacherous. Susanna managed all of this with Felix's help, and with the addition of 2 more ranch hands she had hired in October, men recommended by other small ranchers in the area who were, in the absence of Greer's operation looming over the district, beginning to breathe more freely and work together more generously. There was something different in the valley now, something that had not been there before, a community feeling, the sense of people who had been made to be afraid of each other rediscovering that they did not have to be. Lionel's assignment in the district was extended through the winter and into the spring, which he told Susanna was on account of the ongoing Greer investigation, and which was true, and which was also, he acknowledged to her honestly, something he had requested because he had no intention of leaving Caldwell Creek before the matter between them was resolved. "What resolution did you have in mind?" she asked him one evening in January, standing in the kitchen with snow outside and the wood stove going and the lamp making the room warm and gold. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her with the directness that was one of the things she most valued about him. "Marriage," he said, "if you were willing, when you were ready. I am not asking for any particular answer tonight, only yes," she said. He blinked. "Yes." "Yes," she said again, with the slight amusement in her voice that she reserved for moments when his habitual carefulness outpaced the speed of events. "I am willing, and I am ready. I am not going to pretend otherwise to satisfy a convention about appropriate mourning periods when I know my own mind." He crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands with such gentleness that she had to close her eyes for a moment just to hold the feeling. And he kissed her for the first time in the warm kitchen with the snow outside, and it was the kind of kiss that people who have taken their time arriving at something give each other, unhurried and sure and full of everything that had been quietly accumulating for months. "I will be a good partner to you," he said when they separated. "I can promise you that honestly." "I know," she said, "and I to you." They were married in the spring, on the first Saturday in April of 1884, when the new growth was coming up bright green on the hillsides, and the desert was doing the extraordinary thing it does in spring, the blooming that looks like it is happening too fast and too extravagantly, but is actually just the land making up for lost time. Reverend Platt conducted the ceremony in the church, because whatever his limitations as a comforter, he was thorough as an officiant. Abernethy and his wife came. Doc Hennessy came and looked better than he had in years. Dix Fowler came and brought his wife and shook Lionel's hand with the specific enthusiasm of a man who felt personally invested in the outcome. Felix, who had grown to be quietly devoted to Susanna in the way of young people who attach their sense of the world's rightness to someone who has shown them what rightness looks like, stood in the front row and was trying very hard not to show how moved he was and failing completely. Susanna wore a dress of deep blue, not black, which she had chosen deliberately and without apology. She had mourned Harlan honestly, and she was not going to continue to signal mourning when what she felt was something else entirely. Blue for the New Mexico sky, which was the thing she had loved first and most consistently about being in the territory. Blue for the particular color of the morning light on the day she had walked into the courthouse and changed everything. Lionel stood at the altar waiting for her with a posture that was straight and still, and a face that was not still at all, not in the way it usually was. The control he habitually maintained over his expression had given way to something open and uncomplicated and real. She walked toward him and watched it happen, and felt her own chest full of something so warm it was almost difficult to contain. When Reverend Platt asked him if he took this woman as his lawfully wedded wife, Lionel said yes in a voice that was quiet but completely certain, and it was the certainty that she heard above everything. They said the words. They exchanged the rings, simple silver bands that Lionel had had made by the metalworker in Socorro, taking her hand measurements one evening under the pretense of helping her with something, and producing the rings 2 weeks later with a careful satisfaction that made her laugh, and then hold the rings and feel the weight of them and understand exactly what they meant. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at the church hall that turned into something livelier than a reception had any formal right to be in 1884 in a small western town, which was to say there was music and dancing and more food than any gathering of this size had a logical need for, and people stayed until the evening because they were enjoying themselves, and because the occasion seemed to warrant it. Susanna danced with Lionel in the church hall, which had a plank floor that was not level and a fiddle player who was enthusiastic rather than precise, and it was perfect. She had her hand in his and his arm at her back, and the lamplight was warm, and the faces around them were the faces of the community that she had built something into and that had supported her when it counted, and she thought that this was what the territory could be when it was not afraid of itself. "What are you thinking?" Lionel asked, because he always asked when he saw that particular quality of reflection on her face. "I'm thinking that this is exactly where I want to be," she said. "Good," he said. And he turned her, and the fiddle played on. They settled into the life of the ranch together, with a naturalness that surprised neither of them, because they had already been practicing it, already falling into each other's rhythms over months of Thursday evenings and working days, and the ordinary shared texture of being around someone, until they become part of how you understand the world. Lionel's assignment as territorial marshal for the district became, through the spring and summer of 1884, a more permanent arrangement as the territory reorganized its law enforcement structure, and Caldwell Creek was designated as a district headquarters. This meant that he was based there, permanently, which meant he was home. Home. The word settled into its right shape. He was a good partner, exactly as he had promised. He did not try to reshape the ranch in his own image, or displace the management decisions that Susanna had made with competence and care. He contributed what he knew, which included a facility with the business side of things, with the record-keeping and the negotiations and the broader cattle market conditions, which had not been Harlan's strength and had not been Susanna's either, but which proved to be something Lionel understood naturally. Together they built the operation into something more effective than it had been under Harlan alone, and Susanna found that working alongside a person who respected your judgment was a fundamentally different experience from working in the shadow of one who did not. In November of 1884, 7 months after their wedding, Susanna told Lionel that she was expecting a child. They were sitting at the kitchen table after supper, in the domestic ease of an evening that had become familiar and beloved, and she told him plainly because she did not know any other way to tell things. He was still for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand, always that gesture, the hand deliberate and gentle, and he said, "How are you feeling?" "Surprised," she said, "and glad." "So am I," he said, and the open, uncontrolled quality that his face took on in private, the one she had come to love most about him, was there fully. Both of those things. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was cold and long and full of the particular satisfaction of waiting for something good. Susanna continued to manage the ranch through most of the pregnancy with what her doctor described as an alarming level of competence, and she described as simply getting on with things. Lionel worked with a focused protectiveness that was not smothering but was constant, and she found she did not mind being looked after by someone who did it with such evident care and so little need for her to be diminished in the process. In March of 1885, on a cold, clear morning when the light on the mesa was the color of old gold, their son was born. They named him William Harlan Barker, William for Lionel's father and Harlan for the man who had built the ranch and the life that their son would grow up in, because it seemed right to carry something of him forward. The baby had Lionel's dark hair and Susanna's blue eyes, and the particular personality of someone who had arrived with opinions, which he expressed with vigor and without apology. Felix, who was 20 now and had taken on the role of head ranch hand with a seriousness that would have impressed anyone, was the first person outside the house to hold the baby, because Susanna trusted him and because he looked, holding the infant, exactly like someone for whom the world had just arranged itself into a shape he had not known to hope for. Doc Hennessy attended the birth and after, sitting in the kitchen with coffee while Lionel sat beside Susanna's bed with the baby in his arms, told his wife that evening that there were days in medicine when the work was worth all the other days, and that day had been one of them. The spring of 1885 was extraordinary. The territory was in one of its bloom years, when the rain had been sufficient and the timing perfect, and the hillsides around the ranch were dotted with wildflowers that had no business being so numerous and so bright but were anyway. Susanna sat on the porch in the mornings with William in her lap and watched the light change on the mesa and felt, with a fullness that was not simple or uncomplicated but was real and earned, that her life was her own. The Greer trial had concluded in late 1884 with the verdict and sentencing she had anticipated. Prout was in prison in Santa Fe. The land that had been taken from the three ranching families was in various stages of being returned or compensated, a process that was slow and imperfect in the way of territorial legal processes, but that was moving. The two other families who had lost men to Greer's operation had received some measure of formal acknowledgement, and while no legal outcome could restore what had been taken from them, the acknowledgement was not nothing. Susanna thought about those families sometimes, about the wider reality of what had been happening in the district before Lionel's arrival, before her 24 hours. She thought about the way power operated in small places, how it pressed down on the people least able to resist it, and how the only countermeasure was clarity and courage, and the willingness to say clearly what was true. She had been lucky that she had known enough to see what was in front of her, lucky that Abernethy and Hennessy had been the kind of people they were, lucky that Lionel Barker had arrived in Caldwell Creek 3 days before Harlan was buried and had stood at the graveside with his hat in his hands. Luck, and what you did with it. That was the equation. On an evening in late May, when William was 2 months old and asleep in his crib in the small room off the main bedroom that Lionel had built with his own hands over the course of a February week, Susanna and Lionel sat on the porch in the long May twilight and watched the stars come out one by one over the mesa. She was in the larger chair and he was on the steps with his back against the post, close enough that her feet, tucked under herself, were nearly touching his shoulder. "Tell me something," she said. "What sort of something?" "Anything you haven't told me yet," she said. "Something from before." He thought for a moment, and she liked watching him think, the particular quality of his attention when he was retrieving something from memory that he actually wanted to share. "When I was 12, he said, I told my father I wanted to be a lawyer. He said that was the worst idea he'd ever heard, that lawyers were people who got between honest men and honest outcomes, and that if I wanted to be useful I should learn to be someone people could rely on in practice rather than in argument. And, she said, and he was right about the being useful part, Lionel said, though I've revised my opinion of lawyers somewhat. Abernethy, for instance. Abernethy is not a lawyer, he's a clerk. He's the best kind of lawyer, Lionel said. The kind who only says what's true." She laughed, and he turned to look at her at the sound of it with the expression she thought she would never tire of, the one that was simply him being glad that she was there. "What about you?" he said. "Something from before," she considered. "When I was 17, I told my mother I intended to go west. She cried for 3 days and then helped me pack and said if I was going to be foolish I should be thoroughly foolish and go all the way." She paused. She meant New Mexico. She thought New Mexico was as far as one could reasonably go and still be considered to have a plan. Was she right? About the plan, yes, Susanna said. About New Mexico being the end of the journey, I think it's been the beginning of one. He reached up and took her hand from where it rested on the arm of the chair and held it without saying anything, because he didn't need to. They stayed on the porch until the full dark had come, and the stars were brilliant and excessive above them. And from inside the house there came the small sounds of William beginning to wake from his nap, and Susanna stood and went in to him, and Lionel followed, because that was what they did. They moved through the life they had made together, attending to its requirements and its gifts in equal measure, neither of them under the illusion that it was simple or that it would always be easy. Both of them certain that it was right. William grew into a boy who had his mother's directness and his father's patience, a combination that proved to be formidable and occasionally exhausting in the way of children who know exactly what they want and are willing to wait for the right moment to ask for it. He learned to ride at 3 and was fearless about it in a way that made Lionel proud and Susanna protective, and both of them watchful in the manner of parents who have decided that courage in a child is to be nurtured rather than suppressed. In the summer of 1887, Susanna told Lionel she was expecting again, and this time there was less surprise and more of the specific, settled gladness of people who have already learned what a child does to a life and are welcoming the expansion. Their daughter, born in February of 1888, was named Clara Me Barker. She arrived with dark eyes and an expression of assessment that made Doc Hennessy say she looked like someone who had already formed an opinion about the situation and was reserving judgment on whether to approve of it. She was, from the beginning, herself in a complete and unwavering way, and Susanna looked at her daughter and felt something that she recognized as recognition, the specific pleasure of seeing yourself in someone else without the parts that had made the original difficult. William treated his sister with the solemn responsibility of a 4-year-old who has been told he has a job now and has taken this very seriously. He was, in the way of older siblings who are good at heart, protective in ways that were sometimes helpful and sometimes entirely unnecessary, and always completely sincere. The ranch expanded through the late 1880s as the territory changed around it. New settlers came. The railroad pushed closer, and the market for cattle improved, and Caldwell Creek grew into a proper town with a school, and a second doctor, and a newspaper that Susanna read every week with the critical attention of someone who had personal experience of the distance between what was printed and what was true. She wrote letters to the newspaper sometimes, correcting inaccuracies, and the editor published them because her writing was precise, and because the town understood, collectively, that Susanna Easton Barker was not someone whose letters you declined to publish. Lionel continued his work as territorial marshal with the same methodical competence, handling the ordinary business of frontier law, which was less dramatic than stories suggested and more exhausting, and handling it well. He was respected throughout the district in a way that was earned rather than imposed, which was the only kind of respect he had ever been interested in. He was home for supper most nights. He was present. These were not small things. On the evening of their 5th anniversary, in the spring of 1889, they sat again on the porch with the same stars and the same mesa, and the sounds of 2 sleeping children from inside the house. The territory was about to change. Statehood was being discussed in the papers, the old wild freedom of the frontier giving way to the ordered structures of incorporation, which was both loss and gain and had the complicated texture of all real things. "Are you afraid of it?" Lionel asked, "the territory becoming something else?" "No," Susanna said without hesitation. "The territory becoming itself more fully, that's not something to be afraid of. That's just time." She looked at him. "Are you?" "I was," he said. "When I first came here, I thought what I loved about it was the looseness, the room to move. I thought bringing more law and more order was something that would cost something I valued." He was quiet for a moment. "I understand now that what I actually love about it is the land and the people who are honest in it. That doesn't go away with statehood." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." The night was enormous around them, as it always was, and the stars were the particular brightness of high altitude and clean air. And somewhere across the mesa, a coyote called and was answered. And the house behind them held the sleeping weight of their children and the accumulated years of their life together. And Susanna thought that there was nothing she would have changed, not even the hardest parts. Because the hardest parts had been the ones that showed her clearly who she was and what she could do, and who was worth standing beside. She thought about the night of the notice, the 24 hours, the way the clock of it had felt pressing and absolute, each hour a resource to be used and not wasted. She had used them. She had walked into the courthouse at dawn with the evidence she had gathered, and she had not flinched, and the world had rearranged itself into a shape that was more just than it had been before, not perfectly just. The territory was not a place of perfect justice, and perhaps no place was, but more, and that was worth the 24 hours and everything they had cost her. "What are you thinking?" Lionel asked. "The courtroom," she said. "That morning." He nodded slowly. "I think about it too." "What do you think about?" He considered for a moment, and then he said, "I think about the way you sat in that front row, the way you held yourself through all of it, There was something, it was the most composed I've ever seen anyone be in circumstances that warranted the opposite. He paused. I think that was the morning I was certain. Certain of what? He looked at her with the full openness of his private face. The one she had come to understand was reserved for her and for their children, and for the quiet of the evenings when he was simply himself rather than the version of himself he presented to the world. Certain that you were it, he said. For me, all of it. She reached across and took his hand as he had always taken hers, deliberately and with the full intention of keeping it. I know, she said. I was certain that morning, too. They sat like that as the night deepened around them, the spring air cool and fragrant, the mesa dark and enormous against the starlit sky, the house warm and full behind them. Two people who had come to the same place by different roads and found each other at the exact moment when both of them were ready to recognize what they had found. Inside, William would wake before dawn, as he always did, drawn by some internal urgency he would not be able to explain. He would get up and pad in his socks to the window and look out at the early morning dark, and then he would come to find his parents, as he always did, and find them already awake and already together, which was the only version of the world he knew and which formed in him the unshakable conviction that the world was a place where people found each other and held on. Clara would sleep until the sun was well up, as she always did, with the absolute self-possession of someone who had decided that the world could wait for her. She would wake with her dark eyes clear, and her opinions already formed about what she wanted for the morning, and she would communicate these opinions with a directness that had clearly come from somewhere specific in the family line. The ranch would continue. The territory would change. The law would settle more firmly over the land, and with it more safety for the people who had always deserved it and never had it. The small ranchers of the Caldwell Creek Valley, freed from the weight of Greer's operation, would build something together over the years that was more resilient than what any of them could have built alone. A community in the true sense, people who knew each other's troubles and helped with them. Abernethy would retire in 1891, and his wife would make him a garden that was the envy of every household in town. Doc Hennessy would continue to practice, and to drink somewhat less than before, and to tell the story of the 24 hours to anyone who had not already heard it. Dix Fowler would expand his feed store into a proper mercantile, and his son would take it over, and it would still be standing decades later. Felix would save enough by 1892 to buy a small parcel of land east of the Easton Ranch and start his own operation, and Susanna and Lionel would help him do it with the cheerful practicality of people who understood that helping others build something was part of what building something meant. And on the Easton Ranch, which kept its name because it had been built on that land, and the name honored what had been built, Susanna and Lionel Barker would grow into the life they had chosen for each other with the same quality of attention and care they had brought to everything from the beginning. There would be hard years, a drought in 1890 that tested everyone, a winter in 1893 that was cruel enough to change the calculations on more than one operation in the valley. And they would move through those years with the particular partnership of people who have already been tested and already know what the other person is made of and trust it. On quiet evenings, which were more frequent than the stormy ones, Lionel would sometimes read to Susanna from whatever book he had most recently acquired from the circulating library in Soccer Row, because she had told him once that she loved to be read too, and he had filed that information in the category of things that mattered and acted on it consistently from that day forward. She would listen with her eyes half closed and her feet tucked up under her and the firelight warm on her face, and she would feel the specific contentment of someone who knows exactly where they are and wants to be precisely there and nowhere else. The New Mexico Territory became the state of New Mexico in 1912, 29 years after Susanna had stood at her husband's graveside and felt the weight of a world that did not think she mattered settling itself on her shoulders. By then she was 58, and Lionel was 62, and they had lived on the ranch long enough that the land itself seemed to know them, to have shaped itself around the rhythm of their presence. William was 27, managing a cattle operation of his own east of Caldwell Creek, married to a woman named Ruth who was from Colorado, and had her own opinions about everything, which was how it should be. And they had 2 boys who were as different from each other as siblings can be, and who fought with the committed energy of children who love each other extremely. Clara was 24, studying to be a schoolteacher in Albuquerque, which had been her intention since she was 9 years old, and which she was pursuing with the unwavering certainty of someone who had decided a thing, and saw no reason to revisit the decision. She wrote long letters home and received long letters back from her mother, who had always understood that correspondence was how you kept people with you across distance. On the day that New Mexico became a state, there was a gathering in Caldwell Creek that was the largest the town had seen in years. There were speeches and a band, and an abundance of food in the tradition of all gatherings in small western towns. Susanna stood beside Lionel in the main street as the speeches were made and the official documents read, and she felt the strange layered quality of a moment that is both the end of something and the beginning of something else. Lionel's hand was around hers, still deliberate, still gentle, still the same. "Well," he said, when the formalities were done and the band had begun and the crowd was moving and celebratory around them. "What do you think?" She looked at him, this man she had chosen and been chosen by, this steady, careful, honest man who had stood at a graveside with his hat in his hands and changed the direction of her life by simply being present and paying attention. "I think," she said, "that it took long enough." He laughed, which was still the thing that moved her most about him, because he did not do it often, and when he did it was entirely real. "I think," she continued, "that we are not finished yet." "No," he agreed. "Not by a considerable distance." She leaned into him slightly, as she had learned to do over 29 years, and he put his arm around her, as he had learned to do, and they stood together in the sun of the first day of a new state on the land that was theirs, that had always been theirs, that they had fought for and held and built upon and loved, as the music played around them and the blue sky of New Mexico went on above them forever. The morning they had walked into the courthouse together had been the first morning of everything that followed. She had carried the evidence and he had stood beside her, and the world had been required to acknowledge what was true, and from that acknowledgement everything else had grown: the ranch, the children, the years, the life that was exactly what they had made it and no less. It was enough. It was far more than enough. It was the whole of it, and it was good.